The air in the small parlor was thick with the scent of beeswax and finality. Alara stood by the window, her gaze fixed on the familiar silhouette of the oak tree her grandfather had planted, its branches stark against the pale, indifferent sky. She was 24 years old, and the world she had known her entire life was being dismantled, board by silent board, around her. Her stepfather, Silas, sat at the heavy mahogany desk where her father, and his father before him, had managed the affairs of their modest homestead. He was not a cruel man, not in the way of loud words or heavy hands. His cruelty was quieter, a thing of ledgers and ink, of practicality so sharp it cut to the bone. "The papers are signed, Alara," he said, his voice as dry as the dust motes dancing in the afternoon sunbeams. He did not look at her. His attention was on a stack of documents, his pen scratching methodically. "The new owners will arrive in a week's time. You'll need to be gone by then." She did not turn. She felt the words land, not with a shock, but with the dull thud of an expected blow. Her mother had been gone 6 months, the victim of a winter fever that had stolen the warmth from the house and left only a hollow echo. With her mother went Alara's last claim to this place. Silas was a man of forward momentum, and she was an anchor to a past he was eager to shed. He was joining a large wagon train heading for the Oregon territories, a new life under a bigger sky, and she was not part of the manifest. "Here," he said, pushing a small, thin envelope across the polished wood. "This is what's left after settling the estate and my purchase of a stake in the company. $50. It should be enough to see you to a new situation." $50. An insult wrapped in currency. It was the price of a decent horse, perhaps, or a few months' board in a respectable house. It was not the price of a life, of a home built by her grandfather's hands, of the field she had walked and the river she had known since birth. She finally turned to look at him. His face was a mask of detached administration, his eyes focused on his task, refusing to meet hers. He was already gone, his spirit halfway to the western horizon. She did not cry. She did not plead. Her grandfather, Elias, had taught her better. Elias had been a surveyor, a man who understood the world through angles, elevations, and the unwavering truth of a magnetic needle. He had seen the quiet competence in his granddaughter when others saw only a shy girl. While other girls learned needlepoint, Alara learned to read a topographical map. While they learned recipes, she learned the mathematics of a king-post truss and the proper way to mix lime mortar. "The world can take everything from you, Ellie," he used to say, his hands, calloused and kind, guiding hers as she learned to use an adze. "Your property, your position, your people. But it can never take what you know how to do. Competence is a fortress no army can breach." He had died 5 years ago, leaving her with a legacy not of land, which was now lost, but of skill, and one other thing. From a small, locked chest in her room, she retrieved it. It was a surveyor's compass, heavy and solid in her palm. The case was made of brass, worn to a soft, dull gleam from her grandfather's touch. It wasn't a simple pocket compass. It was a precision instrument with a vernier scale for reading fine angles and a needle lift mechanism to protect the jeweled pivot. When she released the needle, it settled on north with a steady, unerring certainty. It was her grandfather's guidance, his truth, distilled into a single, perfect object. It was her true self. She packed a single canvas satchel. She took no furniture, no keepsakes from the house that was no longer hers. Such things were heavy with memory and useless for the road ahead. Instead, she packed her grandfather's tools, a small hand axe, a whetstone, a folding saw, a plumb bob, a ball of twine, and a small leather-bound journal filled with his notes on construction and celestial navigation. She packed a loaf of bread, a wedge of cheese, and a water skin. At the bottom of the bag, she placed the $50. Then she slid the brass compass into her coat pocket, where its weight was a constant, reassuring presence against her hip. She walked out the front door and did not look back. The road was a ribbon of dust, winding through a landscape that grew less familiar with every step. For days, she walked, her rhythm steady and methodical. She bought passage on a northbound freight wagon for a time, sharing the rumbling journey with silent, weathered men who paid her no mind. She ate sparingly, slept rolled in her blanket under the stars, and spoke only when necessary. The hollow ache of her loss was a constant companion. But grief, she knew, was a luxury she could not afford. Grief was heavy, and she needed to travel light. She was adrift, a solitary vessel on an indifferent sea, with only the compass in her pocket to tell her which way was true. In a dusty, wind-scoured town called Terminus, she stopped to refill her water skin at the public well. The place was little more than a collection of clapboard buildings leaning against each other for support, a last gasp of civilization before the vast, empty plains to the west and the jagged teeth of the mountains to the north. At a nearby saloon, 2 old trappers sat on the porch, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. Their voices, rough as burlap, carried on the dry air. "Heard they're finally selling off Cutter's Folly for the back taxes," one said, scratching at his grizzled beard. $50 to own the biggest pile of rocks this side of the divide," the other rasped, letting out a wheezing laugh. "Place is cursed. Jedediah Cutter thought he'd found a shortcut through the peaks, a secret pass. Built that fort of his right at the mouth of it. Him and his whole party just vanished. Swallowed by the mountain, they say." "Rockfalls and bad water," the first trapper added. "And ghosts. No one's been up there in 20 years. Worthless." Ilara's hand went to her pocket, her fingers closing around the cool, solid brass of the compass. $50, the exact sum she possessed. A folly, a ruin, a worthless pile of rocks. But it was a place. It was an anchor. The word shortcut snagged in her mind, a surveyor's term, a puzzle. Her grandfather had taught her that there were no shortcuts, only smarter paths that others were not equipped to see. Perhaps Jedediah Cutter had seen one. She found the territorial land office in a small, cramped building at the end of the main street. The clerk, a man named Mr. Finch, was thin and sallow, with ink stains on his fingers and a permanent smirk etched into his face. He looked at her, a young woman alone with a dusty satchel, and his eyes held a mixture of pity and amusement. "I'd like to inquire about a property," she said, her voice steady. "Known as Cutter's Folly." Mr. Finch's smirk widened. "The old Cutter fort? Lady, you don't want that. It's a death trap. The deed ain't worth the paper it's printed on." "I'm told it's being sold for back taxes," Ilara persisted, laying her $50 on the counter. The bills were crisp, the sum of her worldly wealth. He stared at the money, then back at her, and shrugged. "Your funeral. $50 it is." He pulled a dusty ledger from a shelf, and after much licking of his thumb and turning of brittle pages, produced a deed. He filled it out with a flourish, his pen scratching loudly in the quiet room. As he handed it to her, his smile was pure mockery. "Congratulations, miss. You are now the proud owner of a league of prime rattlesnake habitat and the ghost of Jedediah Cutter himself. Try not to get crushed in your sleep." She took the deed, folded it neatly, and placed it in her satchel. "Thank you," she said, her expression unreadable. She turned and walked out, leaving the clerk to chuckle to himself. The transaction was complete. She was no longer adrift. She had a destination. The journey to the fort took another 2 days on foot, following a barely there trail that climbed steadily from the plains into the foothills of the mountains. The air grew cooler, scented with pine and damp earth. The landscape became wilder, more severe. Finally, she rounded a massive granite outcropping and saw it. Cutter's Folly. The trappers had not exaggerated. It was a ruin. It had been built on a wide, defensible ledge at the base of a sheer cliff face, overlooking a narrow, winding canyon that was, she presumed, Cutter's supposed shortcut. The fort's outer walls were thick, made of massive, locally quarried stone, but long sections had collapsed into heaps of rubble. The heavy timbers of the gatehouse had rotted through and fallen, and the roofs of the main buildings were gone, their skeletal rafters open to the sky. A profound silence hung over the place, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the shattered stones. For a long moment, Elara felt a wave of despair so cold and sharp it stole her breath. Mr. Finch's mocking laughter echoed in her ears. She had traded the last of her money for a ghost story and a pile of rocks. The sheer scale of the dereliction was overwhelming. What had she been thinking? The fortress her grandfather had spoken of, the fortress of competence, felt like a child's fantasy in the face of this monumental failure. But then, the feeling passed, replaced by something else. A quiet, stubborn resolve. This was hers. This pile of rocks. This failure. This folly. It belonged to her. She took a deep breath of the clean, mountain air and slung the satchel from her shoulder. The first task her grandfather had always taught was to assess the foundation. She spent the rest of the day walking the perimeter, her eyes scanning not for what was lost, but for what remained. The man who built this, Jedediah Cutter, had been no fool. The location was masterfully chosen, with a clear spring bubbling up from the rock at one end of the compound, and sheer cliffs protecting the rear. The stonework, where it still stood, was expert. The massive blocks were fitted together with a precision that spoke of immense skill and patience. She found her shelter in the base of what must have been a watchtower at the fort's southwest corner. 3 of its 4 walls were still standing, solid and unbreached, reaching a height of nearly 20 feet. The 4th wall had partially collapsed, but it created a protected, 3-sided space, sheltered from the wind. The floor was a mess of fallen stones, dirt, and the debris of decades. This would be her starting point. This small, defensible corner of the ruin would be her home. For the next week, she worked from dawn until dusk. Her life became a rhythm of methodical labor. She cleared the rubble from the tower base, hauling the smaller stones out by hand, using a fallen timber as a lever to move the larger ones. She sorted the stones into piles, usable building blocks, smaller pieces for chinking, and gravel for fill. She swept the dirt floor down to the hard-packed earth. She used her saw to cut away the rotten, dangling ends of the ceiling joists above. The work was brutally hard, her muscles screaming in protest, her hands scraped and raw. But with each stone she moved, each shovelful of dirt she cleared, the space became less of a ruin and more of her own. One afternoon, as she was clearing the last of the rubble from the base of the interior wall, her shovel struck something that rang with a different sound. It was not the dull thud of earth or the grating scrape of stone. It was a clean, solid sound. She knelt and brushed away the dirt. She was looking at the floor, at the massive flagstones that met the base of the tower wall. But here, the stonework was different. While the rest of the fort was built with mortared stone, the base of this wall, for a section about 6 feet wide, was dry stacked. The seams between the massive blocks were almost invisible, fitted with a watchmaker's precision. It was a technique her grandfather had revered, one that required immense skill, and in the center of this section, at floor level, was a single, large keystone. It was perfectly square, its surface smooth, and unlike the stones around it, it seemed to have no mortar at all. She ran her fingers along the seam. It was so fine a knife blade could not have fit within it. She pressed against it. It was immovable, a solid part of the mountain itself. Yet it was an anomaly, a deviation in the pattern. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her mind. Nature is filled with random variation, but a man's work always has a purpose. Look for the place where the pattern breaks. That's where the story is. This was where the pattern broke. Why would a builder, in the foundation of a tower, switch to a more difficult and time-consuming technique for just one small section? It made no structural sense, unless the structure was not its only purpose. She retrieved her crowbar from her small collection of tools. She tried to find purchase in the seam, but it was too fine. She examined the stone again, her eyes tracing every inch of its surface. In the very center, almost invisible, was a tiny drilled hole, no bigger than a pea, filled with dust and grit. She carefully cleaned it out with a twig. It looked like a socket. She thought of her tools. Her grandfather's plumb bob was heavy, made of solid brass with a hardened steel tip. She fetched it from her satchel. The tip fit perfectly into the hole. With the plumb bob seated, she had a handle. She pulled. Nothing. She braced her feet and leaned back with all her weight. Still nothing. It was not meant to be pulled. She thought about the shape. A keystone. A keystone distributes weight outwards. To remove it, you must relieve the pressure. But this was at the bottom. She looked closer at the seam above it. There was a hairline crack, a faint line of shadow. She inserted the tip of her crowbar into the crack and pushed upwards, levering against the stone above. There was a faint grinding sound and a puff of ancient dust. She had lifted the stone above it by a fraction of an inch. Now she pulled on the plumb bob again. This time, with a deep, grating groan of stone on stone, the keystone moved. It didn't pull out. It slid inwards. She worked it back and forth, slowly, painstakingly, until she had created an opening large enough to peer into. A wave of cool, dry, still air washed over her face, carrying the scent of deep earth and time itself. The darkness within was absolute. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She lit a small tallow lamp she had bought in Terminus, its flame a tiny, brave flicker against the immense dark. Shielding it with her hand, she slid the keystone further and pushed the lamp into the opening. The light revealed a set of steep, narrow stone steps leading down. Taking a deep breath, she squeezed through the opening and began to descend. The air was cold and utterly silent. The steps were perfectly cut, each one solid under her feet. After about 20 steps, she reached a small, level floor. She held the lamp high. She was in a cellar, a perfectly preserved room carved from the living rock beneath the tower. It was not large, perhaps 10 feet by 12. The walls were smooth, the floor level. It was dry as a bone, a testament to the builder's skill in drainage. And against the far wall were 3 heavy, metal-banded crates, the kind used for shipping ammunition. A strange sense of reverence settled over her. This was not a tomb. It was a vault, a place of safekeeping. On a small stone shelf carved into the wall sat a single object, a large ledger wrapped in oilskin and tied with a leather thong. Her hands trembled slightly as she set the lamp down and reached for the book. The oilskin was still supple, the leather tie strong. She unwrapped it carefully. The ledger was bound in thick leather, its pages filled with a neat, angular script. The ink was faded but perfectly legible. The first page read, "The accounts and observations of Jedediah Cutter, master surveyor and sole proprietor of this place, Anno Domini 1849. She set the ledger aside for a moment and turned her attention to the crates. They were sealed shut. Using her crowbar, she worked at the lid of the nearest one. The nails were old and resisted with a screech of protest before letting go. She heaved the heavy lid open. The lamplight fell upon the contents, and she gasped. It was not ammunition. The crate was filled to the brim with gold coins, eagles and double eagles, minted in Philadelphia and New Orleans, gleaming with a soft, buttery light. They were packed in tightly, a fortune beyond her wildest imaginings. She dipped her hand into the coins, the cold, heavy weight of them a shocking, unbelievable reality. She checked the other 2 crates. They were the same. For a long time, she simply stood there, in the silent, secret room, the light of her small lamp reflecting in 1,000 golden eyes. This was the secret of Cutter's folly. Not a shortcut, not a ghost story, but a hoard. But the gold was not the whole story. The real treasure, she sensed, was in the book. She sat on the floor of the cellar, the lamplight pushing back the ancient darkness, and began to read the words of Jedediah Cutter. His story unfolded, not of a man who got lost, but of a man who chose to disappear. He had been a surveyor, like her grandfather, in the employ of a wealthy and ruthless land baron in the East. Cutter had discovered a rich vein of gold on his employer's land, but the baron, a man named Sterling, had cheated him, altering the survey maps and claiming the discovery as his own, casting Cutter out with nothing. Betrayed and hunted, Cutter had faked his own demise, spreading rumors of a mad quest for a shortcut through the impassable mountains. He had then used his own small savings to travel west under a new name, find this secluded spot, and build his fortress. The fort was not a trading post. It was a sanctuary, a place to be free from the greed and deceit of men. The ledger was a meticulous record of its construction, filled with diagrams, calculations, and observations on masonry, carpentry, and the natural world. But it was more than a builder's log. It was a testament. He wrote of his bitterness, but also of the profound peace he found in his solitude and his work. He wrote of the geology of the mountains, the migration of the birds, the changing of the seasons. He had lived here, alone, for nearly 30 years. The final entry, dated in the spring of 1878, was written in a shakier hand. "The weakness comes upon me now," he wrote. "My work is done. The walls are true, and the roof is sound. I have lived a life of my own making, beholden to no man. If these words are ever read, it will be by one who possesses an eye for true things, one who can see the story written in stone and pattern. The gold is of no use to me now. It is the fruit of a bitter tree, but perhaps in new hands it can seed a better orchard. Use it to keep this place whole. Use it to build a life of independence and quiet dignity. That is the only payment I ask. Live the life that was stolen from me. My final resting place is prepared, through the passage behind the hearthstone. Do not disturb it. Let my final peace be, as my life was, solitary." He had signed it simply, J. Cutter. Alara closed the ledger, tears finally blurring her vision. They were not tears of grief for her own loss, but of a profound, aching kinship with this stranger, this ghost who was not a ghost at all. He was a surveyor, a builder, a man betrayed who had found salvation in competence. His story was a mirror of her own, his legacy a blessing she never could have imagined. He had not left her a fortune. He had left her a purpose. The next morning she awoke not with the weight of survival on her shoulders, but with the clear, bright purpose of a builder. The fort was no longer a ruin. It was a project. The gold provided the means, but the ledger provided the blueprint, and her grandfather's lessons provided the skill. She was not just restoring a place. She was honoring a legacy, 2 legacies. That of Elias, her mentor in craft, and that of Jedediah, her benefactor in spirit. Her work began in earnest. With the resources to buy proper supplies, she walked the 2 days back to Terminus. She purchased a sturdy mule, bags of flour, salt, beans, tools she lacked, a good crosscut saw, a set of chisels, a heavy mallet, and sacks of lime for making fresh mortar. She endured Mr. Finch's incredulous stare at the land office as she filed a formal claim update, paid the taxes for the next 10 years in advance with a single gold coin, and ignored the whispers that followed her as she led her laden mule back towards the mountains. The restoration of the fort became her entire world. It was a slow, methodical process that measured time in stones set and timbers raised. She started with the watchtower, her home. Using Cutter's diagrams, she rebuilt the collapsed 4th wall, painstakingly choosing stones from the rubble that fit the pattern. She taught herself to mix the lime mortar to the perfect consistency, a skill detailed in Cutter's notes. She used her plumb bob to ensure every course was true, every corner a perfect right angle. The physical labor was immense, but it was satisfying in a way she had never known. Each stone she lifted into place was a declaration of her presence, a defiance of her past. To roof the tower, she needed heavy beams. She ventured into the thick woods that bordered the fort, searching for straight, strong pine trees. She felled them herself with the crosscut saw, the rhythmic rasp of the blade a lonely song in the vast wilderness. She learned to square the logs with a broadaxe and an adze, peeling away the bark and shaping the raw timber into clean, straight beams. It was the work of a master carpenter, work her grandfather had shown her, and her hands seemed to remember the lessons her mind had almost forgotten. Using a system of levers and a gin pole, she hoisted the massive beams into place, locking them together with joints she carved with painstaking precision. The day she laid the final roof board on the tower and looked out over her small, restored kingdom, a feeling of deep, quiet contentment settled over her. It was the first true home she had ever made for herself. Her solitary existence was eventually interrupted. A man on horseback appeared at the edge of the clearing one afternoon, leading a stray cow. He was broad-shouldered and thick-set, with a soot-stained beard and hands like leather mallets. He stopped and stared, his eyes wide with disbelief at the sight of the rebuilt tower, a thin curl of smoke rising from its new stone chimney. "I'll be," he muttered, his voice a low rumble. He introduced himself as Ben, the blacksmith from a small settlement a few miles down the valley. He had been chasing this stray for 2 days. He looked from her to the perfectly set stones of her new wall. "This is Cutter's Folly." It wasn't a question. "It's my home," Alara replied simply. Ben dismounted and walked closer, running a hand over the fresh mortar joint. He whistled softly. "This is good work. True work." He looked at her hands, calloused and capable. Respect dawned in his eyes, chasing away the surprise. He was a man who understood the world through the things people made with their hands. He saw not a lone woman in a dangerous place, but a fellow craftsperson. "My tools could use a proper smith's touch," she said, gesturing to her worn axe head. "And I need some iron fittings for a new gate." "I need a new pasture line surveyed," he countered, a slow smile spreading under his beard. "My fences are a mess. You know how to use one of them surveyor's transits?" "My grandfather taught me," she said. And so, an alliance was formed, not on sentiment, but on the solid ground of mutual respect and competence. Ben reforged her tools, his hammer ringing in the valley, and crafted her heavy iron hinges. In return, she spent 2 days with her grandfather's compass and a Gunter's chain, laying out a new fence line for him that was perfectly square to the world. Through Ben, she met others. Sarah was a widow who ran a freight wagon, hauling supplies to the scattered mining camps and homesteads in the region. She was practical and sharp-eyed, a matriarch of the wilderness. She saw the neat stacks of squared timber Alara had cleared for her building projects. "The miners at Silver Creek pay a high price for good pit props," Sarah noted, sizing up the wood. "I'll trade you flour, salt, and canvas for a wagon load of them, cut to length." Again, a fair trade. Alara's hard work produced a surplus, and Sarah's network turned that surplus into the necessities she still needed. Then there was Old Man Hemlock, one of the very trappers she had overheard in Terminus. He wandered onto her land one day, drawn by the smoke and the sounds of construction. He was ancient, his face a road map of wrinkles, but his eyes were sharp. He knew the history of this land better than any book. He told her the legends of Cutter's Folly, the stories of ghosts and curses that had kept people away for decades. He was stunned, speechless when she told him the truth and showed him a page from Cutter's ledger. He became her historian, her guide to the mountains. In exchange for a warm meal and a place by her fire, he shared his knowledge, which plants were medicinal, the best way to track game, how to read the coming weather in the clouds. A small, unspoken community began to form around the fort, a web of practical, self-reliant people bound by mutual respect. They rarely spoke of feelings or the past. They spoke of work, of weather, of the price of iron, and the quality of timber. But in their quiet exchanges, in the fair trades and shared knowledge, A deep and sturdy bond was forged. One day in late autumn, a small, ragged group of people appeared on the trail below the fort. They were leading exhausted horses, their wagons battered. Alara watched them from the tower. They were the remnants of a failed wagon train, their dreams of Oregon shattered by a poor guide, drought, and disease. One of the men looked up at the fort, at the impossible sight of a restored, living place where only a ruin should be. He recognized her. A few hours later, a single figure trudged up the path to her gate. It was Silas, her stepfather. He was gaunt, his clothes threadbare, the forward-looking confidence gone from his eyes, replaced by a desperate, hollow look. He stared at the solid new gate she had built, the smoke rising from the chimney, the neatly stacked firewood, the signs of order and prosperity. He saw the fortress she had built, and he could not comprehend it. "Alara," he said, his voice cracking. Our wagon train, we lost everything." He looked at her, the same administrative coldness trying to reassert itself, but failing. "I am still your legal guardian, in a manner of speaking. We need shelter, supplies." Alara looked at him. She felt no anger, no satisfaction, no pity. She felt nothing at all. He was a stranger to her, a figure from a life that no longer existed. He had banished her with a ledger and $50. She had taken his paltry sum and built a kingdom. She had taken her grandfather's lessons and built a fortress. He stood outside the walls, an outcast looking in. She did not say a word. She simply gave a slow, final shake of her head, turned, and went back to the stone she was dressing for the stable wall. The sound of her hammer and chisel, steady and sure, was the only answer he received. He stood for a long moment, a man defeated by a competence he could not understand, then turned and shuffled away. That winter, the true test came. A blue norther, a storm of legendary ferocity, swept down from the peaks with almost no warning. The wind howled through the canyon like a freight train, and the snow fell so thick it erased the world. From her tower, Alara watched the storm swallow the valley. She was safe. Cutter had built his fort to withstand anything, and she had honored his design. The walls did not tremble, the roof did not groan. But then she saw it, a tiny, frantic light far below, a lantern swinging wildly. It was on the main track, where Sarah's freight wagon should have been. The storm had caught her. Without a second thought, Alara banked her fire, bundled herself in heavy furs, and took a lantern. She descended from her fortress into the teeth of the blizzard. She found the wagon slewed sideways in a drift. One of its axles snapped. Sarah was trying desperately to calm her terrified horses and shield her young son from the wind. Alara's arrival was a miracle. Using her knowledge of leverage and timber, Alara helped Sarah brace the wagon. They unhitched the horses and, shielding the boy between them, began the slow, brutal climb back to the fort. Just as they reached the gate, another figure emerged from the swirling snow. Ben, the blacksmith, a heavy coil of rope over his shoulder, his face grim with worry for Sarah. He, too, had seen the lantern. That night, the storm raged, but inside the watchtower of Cutter's Folly, there was a sanctuary. A fire roared in the hearth Jedediah Cutter had built. Sarah's son slept soundly under a pile of furs. The three of them, the builder, the smith, and the freighter, sat together, sharing hot coffee and the quiet warmth of survival. A community, forged in the crucible of the storm, had taken root within the fortress walls. As for Cutter's final request, to right the wrong done to him by the Baron Sterling, Old Man Hemlock provided the epilogue. The Sterling family's fortune, built on deceit, had crumbled into dust a generation ago, lost to bad investments and reckless heirs. Time and fate had already balanced the ledger. Jedediah Cutter's only remaining request was the one she was already fulfilling, to live a life of peace and independence. Spring arrived, melting the snow and turning the valley green. The world was reborn, and so was the fort. Alara stood on the parapet of her finished watchtower as the dawn broke, painting the mountain peaks in hues of rose and gold. Below her, the fort was no longer a folly, but a thriving homestead. A small, tilled garden was protected by a new stone wall. Ben was at a forge he and Alara had built in the courtyard, the cheerful ring of his hammer echoing in the crisp morning air. Sarah's son chased a pair of chickens near the new stable. Inside her room in the tower, on a shelf made from a single, smooth piece of pine, two objects sat side by side. One was her grandfather's brass compass, its needle pointing, as always, to true north. The other was a piece of uncut quartz with a brilliant vein of gold running through it, a rock she had found on Cutter's desk in the hidden cellar. The instrument that had shown her the way rested next to the symbol of her destination. She looked out over the canyon, Cutter's supposed shortcut. It was not a shortcut through the mountains. It was a path to a different kind of life. Her grandfather had given her the skills to navigate the world, the competence to build a fortress against its sorrows. Jedediah Cutter, a kindred spirit across time, had given her the foundation on which to build it. Her inheritance had not been land or money, but the resilience of knowledge and the legacy of craft. The $50 had not been the price of a ruin, but the key to a kingdom. It was, she knew with a certainty as true as the compass needle, the best money she had ever spent.